In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 39, and the verse will be on the screen here, it says, "They were oblivious until the flood came and swept them all away. So it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." They were oblivious. I was talking with Ozo during the week, and he says, it was just a couple of days ago, and he says, the Lord has really looked after me this last 8 weeks. And I said to him, has it just been the last 8 weeks? Or, has it been longer than that? Or he says, well, no, it's been longer, but you know what I mean. And he said, I have been more aware of him looking after me over the last 8 weeks. And I want to talk to you just for a few minutes on this word, oblivious. I'm taking Davy Haddock back to Miss Forsyth's English class because he missed too many of them. So me and Davy Haddock's going to look at this word, oblivious. And to be oblivious means to be unaware. And Brian talked about it here as we were talking, and he was saying about growing up and about whenever his mum became a Christian and about coming to church. And he said, I was unaware of what God was doing in my life. I was unaware. And that's what it means to be oblivious to something, is to be unaware of what is going on. And the problem we have even today within today's society and today's culture is we have these things called smartphones. And my 12-year-old, this is his posture now. And he is oblivious. The world, Armageddon, could be breaking out around him. And he will not be aware. He will be oblivious to what's going on around him. And sometimes the reason that we are oblivious is because we are focused on this here when we should be focused on this. We're focused on this when we should be focused on each other. Focus. We've got to get our focus right. If we're not focused, then we will be unaware. We will be oblivious to what is happening. If I'm at the end of church today and there's someone up and they're talking with me, and I'm kind of facing this way, and I'm in conversation with someone, and at the back a riot breaks out because there's only one donut left, and Hacksaw's got his eye on it. And a riot ensues because a 6-year-old also has their eye on it, and Hacksaw's like, "You're not getting that." And a riot breaks out between Hacksaw and a 6-year-old over the last donut. But I can be oblivious to what's going on back there. There's a fight breaking out, but I'm not focused because I'm focused here on this. And sometimes what we need to do in order just to become more aware of what's going on, we need to just, in some cases, look up, or in some cases, just turn. It's a change of perspective. A change of perspective. Brian had the wrong perspective. Because in Brian's life, he talked about all he lived for was the parties, for the drugs, for the alcohol. It consumed him. And even though he was in positions and places where God was spoke about and where God was actually speaking to him, he was oblivious to God in his life because his focus was the parties, his focus was the alcohol, his focus was the drugs. And I want to ask you today, what is your focus? Are you oblivious to what God is doing today, to what God is doing in this world, or to what God is doing in your life? Maybe you're here today and you're not a Christian and you're oblivious to God. Because you've been in that place, you're in that place where Brian was, where he was oblivious. And even though God was spoken about, God has been talked about, God has been discussed, even though God has been speaking to you, you're oblivious to his voice. You're oblivious to him because you're not focused on the right things. In Matthew chapter 24, we're talking about a time during the days of a man called Noah. This is Jesus talking in Matthew about the days of Noah. And one of the things that Jesus says is they were oblivious until the flood came. They were oblivious to God. They were oblivious to what God wanted. They were oblivious to the ark. They were oblivious to everything that God was doing until the flood came. So in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, it talks in Genesis chapter 6 and through 9, it talks about this man called Noah. And God told Noah to build an ark. The reason that God told Noah to build the ark was because God had come to this point where as he looked down at the earth, all he saw was evil. That was all he saw. He says, there's nothing but pure evil on the earth, so I'm going to destroy it. I've had enough. I'm going to destroy it. But it says that God saw favor in Noah. He offered off favor and grace to Noah. He saw favor on Noah's life because Noah was a godly man. He was living the right way. He was living a righteous way, a godly way. And so God says, I'm going to preserve mankind through Noah. And so he goes to Noah and he tells Noah, build an ark. Because there's going to be rain and there's going to be water. And Noah, in Noah's day, they probably had never seen rain before. They'd never encountered rain before, let alone a flood. And yet God says to Noah, I want you to build an ark because there's going to be a flood coming and I'm going to destroy mankind. And so the ark is to give you hope. The ark is to preserve your life. And so Noah spends years upon years upon years building this ark that these people had never seen before and that Noah had never seen before. And God says, that's going to be your hope. That's going to be the thing that brings you out of, that lifts you up and out of my judgment on this earth because of the evil that I see on this earth. And the people were oblivious to what was going on until it was too late, until the flood came. I thank God that I'm able to stand here on this platform and share it with Brian because he was oblivious to what God was doing in his life. God was speaking to him. I was talking to him. Many others were talking to him about God, but he was oblivious to God. And that bridge situation could have turned out so much different. And I thank God that he's alive today and he's able to stand on this platform and share his story. These people were oblivious until it was too late. When the flood came, it was too late. And what has to happen, I believe, in society, in culture, and probably, and perhaps I'm going to say more so, in church, because church folk can be oblivious to what God is doing as much as people in the world. Because we become so focused on the wrong things as Christians, as church folk. We become so focused on the wrong things that we are oblivious to what God is doing in this world. Morris introduced us to a guy a couple of days ago. His name's Andrew. He's from New Zealand, but he's planted a church in California. Absolute amazing conversation that we had with this man out in the coffee shop. These are the kind of conversations that I love having. He's a pastor. He's an author. He's doing so many amazing things. And had an amazing conversation. I love talking about the kingdom of God and talking Bible and all of that there. I absolutely loved the conversation I had with this man because it's so much different from perhaps the normal conversations that you have with some church folk that make you just want to punch them in the nose and tell them to grow up, because that's really what is needed. And so it was amazing just to be able to sit with this man and to hear from him and to share with him and just to go backwards and forwards and have a great conversation around this table, just talking about God, talking about kingdom. And one of the things that we talked about was Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus says that many will come to me on that day and say, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not do many wonderful works in your name? And all these things of church folk that are talking about what they have done in church, but Jesus' response will be, depart from me, I never knew you. We touched a little bit on, I'm going to preach it again at the start of next year, I think, if I can get a chance, on the spirit of Antichrist. The spirit of Antichrist. And we're living in days, church, where the spirit of Antichrist is becoming so much more prevalent in today's culture and society that it reminds me, the days that we're living in remind me of the days of Noah. And that's what Jesus is saying here in Matthew 24. As it was at the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man, at the return of Christ. The days that Noah lived in will be very similar to this. And these are the days that we're living in. And so the church has got to wake up and know and understand the days that we're living in. Andrew, the guy that we met with, he talked about he goes down into Mexico and does outreach in Mexico. He's connected with a guy down there, a pastor of a church. And the stories that he shared, I cannot even share on this platform because of the younger ones in this church. But what he said was, and he went into details of things that have happened, of church members in his church. I think he said, was it something like 40 that have died, that have been martyred in Mexico by the drug cartel who own Mexico. And 40 of them so far, I think this year, have been murdered on the streets because they're Christians, because the churches is the group that is in most opposition to these drug cartels. And the stuff, how they kill them on the streets, he says, would make ISIS look like a Disney Channel. And he explained how they have died on the streets, how they have been murdered, how they have been martyred on the streets. And I couldn't even repeat it from this platform. And he says the church needs to wake up because there's so much demonic activity taking place in Mexico and in California that we're not aware of it as a church. And there are demonic activity, there's demonic activity, Satanists, all of that that's happening, that are actually fasting and praying to Satan. Demonic activity. While the church is sitting watching Netflix, that was his words. And we've got to waken up, church, because we're living in the days of Noah. And they were oblivious until the flood came. Are they oblivious because we're oblivious as a church? And so as a church, we've got to live less oblivious. And things have got to change. And I think that for us, for you, for us together, is that something has to happen. And rather being oblivious to what's going on, we've got to take out the lies that we're listening to. And we've got to live a life where God is so obvious. Where God is obvious in our lives. Where God is obvious in the culture. We are oblivious, but we've now got to live a life that is obvious. That is obvious. When Jesus came to this world, give me a couple more minutes and we'll be finished. When Jesus came to this world, in John chapter 1, it talks about the Word became flesh, but it talks about Him being the light of the world. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem, the Son of God, God in the flesh, and He comes as a light in the darkness. But the darkness has not understood it. The darkness doesn't perceive it. The darkness is oblivious to the light. And John goes on in John chapter 3 when Jesus is having this conversation with Nicodemus, and again he underlines the fact that He is the light of the world. He says, I am the light of the world. Something that is obvious, that should be obvious in darkness, is a light. Because we know that no matter how dark, the darker it gets, then the easier it is to see the light. But we're living in times where it's so dark, yet we're still oblivious to the light that is shining. And so as I come to a close, and I want to encourage you, whatever it is that has happened in your life, he was living a life oblivious to God because there were lies that were being spoken into his life that he was listening to. You're no good. You're not a good father. You're not a good partner. You're no good. You're not even a good employee anymore. You are useless. Lies that he was listening to, which made him oblivious to the voice of God in his life. And I wonder, is that you today? Because God would say to you today, you are loved. You have got a plan, a purpose, a destiny. He has created you with a plan, a purpose, and a destiny, with hope and with a future. And I pray today that you would be no longer oblivious to God in your life, but that He would become so obvious. Get rid of the lies that is being spoke over your life today. Church, wake up. Wake up. Let's see what is going on. Open your eyes and see what is going on in the world today. And allow God to become so obvious in your life. We are called as a church, as we come to a close, to be the light of the world. In Matthew chapter 5, whenever Jesus is speaking at the Sermon on the Mount, and He says, you are the light of the world. In other words, you are to live a life that is obvious. You're to live a life that is obvious, that it's me, that it's God. Live a life of light in darkness, so that let your light shine before all men. Let your light shine before all men. He goes on even in John chapter 12, and he says the same thing about us being a light in darkness. Church, is that what we are? Are we a people that are obvious for others to see God in us? If you're here and you're not a Christian, then I pray that God will become so obvious